The smell of rain in Willow Creek always reminded me of the day my life unraveled. I stood in the hallway of the house I had paid for over 25 years, holding a silk tie that didn't belong to me. It was tucked behind the velvet lining of Vivian's jewelry box, a careless trophy of a life she was living in the shadows. For 3 decades, I believed we were the golden couple of our quiet cul-de-sac. I was Bennett, the dependable architect, and she was Vivian, the woman who held my world together with a smile. But the tie was just the beginning of a trail of breadcrumbs that led to a dark, twisted reality. I didn't just find out about a coworker. I found a second phone hidden in the vents of our master in soot. The messages were not just romantic. They were tactical, discussing bank accounts and properties I never knew existed. My heart didn't just break. It hardened into a cold, heavy stone in my chest. When I confronted her, there were no tears of regret, only the chilling gaze of a stranger. Within 48 hours, I had packed my essentials and moved into a sterile apartment in the city. The legal battle that followed was a surgical extraction of our shared history. I thought my daughter, Skylar, would be my anchor during that storm. She was 29, a woman I had raised to value integrity above all else. But when the truth spilled out, Skylar didn't reach for my hand. She stood firmly behind her mother. She looked at me with a pity that felt more like a weapon than a comfort. Skylar claimed that love was a complex, blinding force that excused even the deepest betrayals. She told me I was being petty for demanding a fair split of the assets she helped Vivian hide. According to Skylar, 30 years of happiness bought her mother the right to stray without consequence. She called me selfish for not simply handing over the keys to our life and walking away quietly. The fight that ended our relationship happened on a Tuesday, under the flickering lights of a roadside diner. She accused me of never truly understanding her mother's needs or the loneliness of their shared secrets. That was the last time I saw her for a year where I became a ghost in my own family tree. 12 months of silence is a long time to reconstruct a shattered identity. I spent my evenings in my new study, not designing buildings, but tracing the digital footprints of the man who stole my life. I discovered that Dominic had ties to a private investment firm that looked suspiciously like a money laundering front. The drama wasn't just in the bedroom. It was in the ledgers of a company that had been slowly siphoning off our joint savings for years. I kept this information to myself, a private detective in my own tragedy, waiting for the right moment to strike. Then, the phone rang on a cold Thursday night, and Skylar's voice broke the stillness of my apartment. She didn't ask how I was, or if I had finally recovered from the depression that almost swallowed me whole. Instead, she launched into a frantic, hysterical confession about her husband, Logan. The irony was so sharp it felt like a physical blow to my ribs. Logan, the man she had praised for his loyalty, had been caught in a hotel room with her closest friend. Skylar was losing her house, her dignity, and her sense of reality all at once. She had been a stay-at-home mother in their upscale suburban home, left with nothing but dwindling savings and a broken heart. She begged me for money for a high-profile lawyer and a place to sleep until she could find her feet. I listened to her breathing on the other end of the line, remembering the way she had looked at me when I was the one drowning. I told her that my resources were tied up and that I wasn't in a position to help, even though my bank account was more than capable. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of everything we hadn't said for a year. When she started calling me selfish again, I reminded her of the diner, the flickering lights, and her defense of blind love. I asked her if Logan's love was also blind, or if he simply didn't realize that what he was doing was wrong, just like she said about her mother. She hung up on me, but the satisfaction I expected to feel was replaced by a grim realization. Skylar mentioned that Vivian had refused to help her, citing a small house and limited funds. I knew Dominic lived in a sprawling estate on the edge of the city with more guest rooms than inhabitants. There was a deeper layer to Vivian's refusal, something involving the money they had moved during the divorce. The investigation into Dominic had uncovered something far more sinister than a simple office romance. He wasn't just a manager. He was a specialist in restructuring family estates for wealthy divorcees. I realized that Vivian hadn't just fallen in love. She had been recruited into a scheme to strip me of my legacy. Skylar's sudden appearance at my doorstep a few days later wasn't just a plea for help. It was a desperate escape from a burning building. She stood there, drenched and trembling, looking less like the defiant woman from the diner and more like the little girl who used to fear the dark. I didn't let her in at first, letting the silence between us grow until it became a physical barrier. When I finally opened the door, she collapsed into the hallway, sobbing about Logan's cruelty and his hidden debts. It turned out Logan wasn't just unfaithful. He had been using Skylar's trust fund to fuel a high-stakes gambling habit. The most shocking part was that Dominic was the one who had introduced Logan to those circles. The betrayal went deeper than I imagined, a web of corruption that connected my ex-wife's lover to my daughter's ruin. I sat across from Skylar in my sterile kitchen, watching her drink tea with shaking hands. I told her I would help, but only on my terms, requiring her to sign over her remaining legal rights to the family trust. It was a test of loyalty, a way to see if she was still her mother's accomplice or a victim seeking true redemption. She signed the papers without reading them, her eyes vacant and filled with a haunted exhaustion. I felt a flicker of the old fatherly love, but I suppressed it, knowing that the game was far from over. That night, I received an anonymous message on my encrypted laptop. It was a photo of Vivian and Dominic in a heated argument outside a luxury hotel, and she looked terrified. The hunter was becoming the prey, and the family drama was shifting into a dangerous game of survival. I realized that if I wanted to save my daughter, I might have to destroy the woman I once promised to protect forever. The following morning, the air in the apartment felt heavy with the scent of expensive coffee and old regrets. Skylar slept on the sofa, her face finally peaceful for the first time in months. I spent the early hours dissecting the documents she had signed, uncovering a hidden clause that linked her assets to a shell company. The digital trail led directly back to Vivian's private lawyer. My ex-wife hadn't just stood by while Logan ruined Skylar. She had been actively harvesting the remains of her own daughter's future. The realization made my blood turn to ice, a cold fury replacing the lingering sadness of our broken marriage. I decided to arrange a meeting with Vivian at our old summer house in Oak Ridge, a place now rotting from neglect. I sent the photo of her and Dominic with a single sentence. "I know what you're doing to Skylar." She arrived an hour late, driving a car that was far too flashy for someone claiming to be broke. We didn't speak as she walked up the creaking porch steps, her eyes scanning the overgrown garden. I watched her from the shadows of the doorway, noticing the way her hands fumbled with her designer handbag. There was a frantic energy about her, the poise she had maintained during the divorce completely shattered. She began to explain that Dominic was threatening her, holding evidence of her own financial indiscretions over her head. She claimed she was trying to save Skylar by moving the money, but the lies tasted like ash in the air between us. I showed her the bank records I had recovered, the ones showing the transfers from Skylar's fund to Dominic's private account. The look of pure terror on her face was the only honest thing I had seen from her in years. She confessed that Dominic had seduced her specifically to gain access to our family's architectural patents. Our entire life, our 30 years of history, had been nothing more than a long-term heist for him. And Skylar had been the collateral damage, a pawn used to keep me distracted and isolated. I told Vivian that I had already contacted the federal authorities regarding the money laundering. Her knees buckled, and she sank onto the dusty floor of the house we once filled with laughter. I stood over her, feeling no joy, only the heavy burden of a truth that had finally come to light. I told her that the only way to keep Skylar out of jail for the fraudulent signatures was for Vivian to confess to everything. The following evening, I invited Dominic and Logan to my city apartment under the guise of a final settlement. I made sure the lighting was dim, the atmosphere thick with the tension of an impending storm. Vivian was there too, sitting in the corner like a ghost of the woman I once knew. Skylar remained hidden in the study, listening to every word through the thin walls of my modern sanctuary. Dominic arrived with the arrogance of a man who thought he had already won the game. He sat across from me, pouring himself a drink from my crystal decanter as if he owned the room. Logan looked like a cornered animal, his eyes darting between me and the door, sensing the trap. I began by laying out the evidence of the architectural leaks, the stolen patents, and the laundered funds. I watched the smirk fade from Dominic's face as I pulled out the original documents he thought were destroyed. But then I played the recording of his conversation with Logan at the underground club. The color drained from Logan's face, and he began to stammer, trying to shift the blame onto Dominic's shoulders. Dominic realized then that I wasn't just an architect. I was a man who had built a cage around him. I told them that the police were downstairs and that the evidence was already in the hands of the district attorney. Vivian stood up then, her voice trembling but clear as she confessed her own role in the deception. She looked at Logan and told him that she had been the one to record their conversations as a final act of protection. The twist was that Vivian had been playing a double game to protect Skylar from Logan's debts. She had stayed with Dominic to gather enough evidence to bury him if he ever turned on our daughter. The room descended into a chaotic blend of accusations as the sirens began to wail in the distance. The blue and red lights of the police cars danced across the white walls of my living room. I watched as they led Logan out, followed by Dominic and finally Vivian for further questioning. I turned to find Skylar standing by the window, her silhouette sharp against the city skyline. She finally understood that her mother's blind love was actually a calculated series of gambles. But she also saw my own ruthlessness, the way I had waited and watched while she suffered. A few days later, a letter arrived from an unknown sender in Switzerland. It contained a single key and a set of coordinates that pointed to a location deep in the mountains. I traveled to a modest structure of weathered cedar and stone, far from the polished streets of Willow Creek. I found the iron lockbox hidden beneath the floorboards in the corner of the small, dusty kitchen. The key turned with a heavy, satisfying click, opening a bridge across the chasm of time. Inside were journals documenting the very first time Dominic's father had tried to infiltrate our family business. This wasn't a new war. It was an inheritance of greed passed down like a genetic curse. Dominic hadn't chosen Vivian by chance. He was finishing a long-term job his father had started 30 years ago. The journals detailed how they had slowly sabotaged my early projects, skimming the difference. I realized that my entire career had been built on a foundation of silent, meticulous sabotage. I sat on the dusty floor, the realization of the scale of the deception washing over me in cold waves. I wasn't just a victim of a cheating wife. I was the target of a multi-generational vendetta fueled by envy. I packed the journals into my bag, knowing that this evidence would do more than just put Dominic in a cell. It would clear my father's name and provide the justice that had been denied to our family for decades. The final settlement was signed in a windowless, suffocating room deep within the courthouse. Dominic was sentenced to 15 years, and Logan received a shorter sentence but a mountain of debt. Vivian was cleared of conspiracy, but she lost everything she had gained in the process. She left Willow Creek for a small, nameless town on the coast with nothing but a single suitcase. Skylar decided to enroll in law school, fueled by the desire to protect others from predators. I told her that the family trust was hers, a tool for her to rebuild her life on her own terms. She accepted only a loan for tuition, wanting to earn her own way and regain her dignity. We walked through the familiar streets, talking about architecture built to last and families that survive the truth. The drama had stripped away the lies until only the raw essence of our bond remained. I was no longer the man who had discovered a silk tie in a jewelry box. I was Bennett, an architect of steel and glass, and finally, the sole architect of my own future.